Is this the Canon that we have been waiting for, or did they fail to fix the fatal flaw that made me sell my Canon R6 Mark I? In this video, we are looking at the brand new Canon R6 Mark II, going over specs and talking about whether or not this camera is for you. I have an actually pretty interesting perspective on this, as I've been a Canon user for 9 years, starting with the Canon 5D Mark II, but I just sold my Canon R6 right before they released this camera and switched to a completely different system. So at the end of the video, we're gonna talk about whether or not I regret switching to this system, but let's talk about the specs on the Canon R6 Mark II. Let's talk about the brand new sensor on the R6 Mark II. You get a 24.2 megapixel sensor compared to the 20 megapixel sensor on the Mark I. Now, does this mean that you're gonna get better low light performance or worse? Typically, having a larger sensor with less megapixels means that you're gonna get better low light performance. Now, the R6 Mark I did not have a hard time in low light by any means. It was a pretty good camera in that sense, but something that's lacking in this camera compared to some of its competitors is a dual native ISO, which simply means that the higher your ISO goes, the noisier you're gonna get. But to be clear, the R6 Mark I was always good in low light, and so I would assume the Mark II is going to be just as good. One big bump that Canon is really marketing in this one is the 40 frames per second with your silent shutter mode, meaning that you can take a ton of photos just by holding that shutter down. You're gonna get 40 frames per second. That is absolutely insane, meaning you will not miss any shots. Now let's talk about autofocus, because taking 40 frames per second does not matter if the autofocus sucks and you're missing all the shots, but the autofocus in the R6 Mark I was always really good, and in the R6 Mark II, it looks like they've added some new features focusing on the AI of the camera. Now in the Mark I, the autofocus was able to detect humans, cars, and animals, but it looks like they've now added horses, trains, planes, and an auto feature, which, if you're asking me, I'm gonna tend to not let the camera pick what I wanna focus on. As much as possible, I wanna take away any AI functionality and kind of choose the focus for myself, but that's pretty cool that they're giving us so many options. And in all of the videos that I've seen online, this functionality works pretty darn good. What remains is also the face, eyes, and body detection of the Canon R6 Mark II, but I used the Canon R6 for quite a few years, and it's not perfect by any means in these talking head situations. It can hunt for focus just like any other camera. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. What I would say is in the photography modes that I never had any issues with the focusing. With all of the modes that it gives you and all of the intelligent AI functionalities, the focus in photography was fantastic. In video mode, I would say it was good, not perfect, but I haven't figured out a camera that's perfect at autofocus yet, so we're still working on that. So let's talk about video mode. It gets a pretty good bump here in now downscaling 6K footage to 4K, giving you a really sharp image. And what's great about the 4K in the R6 Mark II is that there is no longer a crop. On the R6 Mark I, there was a very slight crop when you would go into 4K mode, whereas the R6 Mark II, you no longer have that crop, which is huge, and a benefit that the R6 Mark II has over its competitors, like say the Sony A7 IV, is that the 60 frames per second in the Canon does not have a crop, whereas the Sony, you do get a crop mode when you're in 4K 60 mode. Another addition that they've given you in the R6 Mark II is you can now shoot in 180 frames per second, which means you can get some pretty cool slow motion stuff. Now, of course, this is in only 1080p, not in 4K. If you ever need to do high quality, high-end productions and shoot in RAW, you do have the ability with the R6 Mark II to attach an external recorder, and then you can shoot externally in RAW, which is absolutely amazing. But in most of my use case scenarios, 10-bit 422, unless you're shooting professional content, is good enough. The color retention and the color depth in that is amazing. Now, this next function that they added is actually a really, really big deal, is that firstly, there's a lot less overheating, at least so far in the reviews that we've seen online, but it also has continuous recording, which is so good for YouTubers and people that like to talk to cameras, or if you wanted to set up a second camera and not have to worry about it shutting off after 30 minutes. This is a really big deal, and they've given that to you in 4K 30 and 4K 24. They do warn you if you're going into 4K 60, they don't suggest letting that run longer than 45 minutes or so, but I've seen tests online where they've already successfully gotten it farther than that in normal room temperature conditions like we're shooting right now. One other feature that they've added in the video functions is false color. Now this isn't something that I use a ton, but it is a professional video feature that most of the time you have to buy an external monitor to get these kind of functionalities in it. So it's really cool to see Canon starting to integrate some of these like really professional video tools into their cameras. The image stabilization on the Canon R6 was already really good. You have a couple of different steps of image stabilization that you're able to do, and I always found they were pretty good. There have been complaints on the internet about the wobble that you get in the background. If you watched Peter McKinnon's video on it, he says he didn't notice it as much, but if you see the DP review, they say it's kind of still there. But as a user, again, I didn't really notice it that often, and you're really only going to see those wobbles like crazy if you're kind of walking with the camera. And they have given us several firmware updates over the course of a couple years to try and reduce that wobble effect. Now, one thing that we cannot ignore about the new R6 Mark II is that the body functionalities are different, meaning that the power switch is on one side, and now there's a photo and video switch on the other side where the power switch used to be. Now, I actually kind of like this because I like the ability as a YouTuber vlogger to be able to turn on the camera and hit record all from the same side. I don't have to switch which sides of the camera I'm using to turn on the camera or not. So I actually think that's a really cool function. But my question here is, did this fix the fatal flaw that the R6 had? And that is, because you have photo modes and video modes, can you switch the custom dials for both photography and videography? In the Canon R6 Mark I, there's 3 custom modes, and you can only set them for photography. They have not given us firmware updates to be able to change that, and that is the major reason why I switched over camera systems. The Sony gives you the ability to change those custom modes into video, and the Lumix S5, which I have changed over to, also gives you the ability to change those custom modes. Now, what I'm seeing on the R6 Mark II is that you have 3 custom dials and photography and video switches. So my hope is, and because I don't have my hands on the camera, is that this fixes the fatal flaw that you cannot just set your settings in video modes and then just turn that dial to go from, say, 4K 24 and then switch the dial to 4K 60 and have your shutter speeds changed already. In watching the DP review of the R6 Mark II, they already struggled with the fact that when you're switching between video modes, the settings don't stay the same. So that kind of tells me that either they didn't have enough time with the camera, or having the ability to change those custom modes to have your settings set for what you're using regularly, for example, 4K 24 and 4K 60, and then not forgetting to change your shutter speed to be the appropriate double of your frame rate. I've done it a ton, and so for me, this is the fatal flaw and a perk of any camera that you can set the custom dials on. So I'll be really curious to get hands on this camera to see if you actually can change those custom dials. That was a long rant on custom dials, but I think it's super important to have that in it. So I'm done with that rant. So as a previous user of the Canon R6 and now a user of the Lumix S5, who do I think that the R6 Mark II is for? Well, priced at $2,500 US dollars and 3,300 Canadian dollars, it's still a pricey camera. I'd say if you're coming from a camera in the video space specifically that does not have 10-bit 422 colors, that is something you will notice a big difference on. If you're already in the Canon ecosystem, this makes a lot of sense for you, whether you're rocking RF glass or you get the EF adapter. I think that also makes a lot of sense, but something to be aware of, RF glass is taking a long time to come up with cost-effective lens options for you. So that's something to consider as well. In most use cases, 24 megapixels is enough to shoot professional work. I've done it. I've shot a lot of professional work with the R6 Mark I, which was a 20 megapixel camera. So if you're upgrading for the megapixels alone, you don't really have to, but I do think the 24 megapixels is a great kind of sweet spot. Upgrading to the Lumix S5, it's in the same range as well, around the 24 megapixels. But in there is something to consider, is that the Lumix S5 is also a full frame camera, has a lot of the features that the Canon R6 Mark I has, some extra ones, and has the custom mode, has incredible image stabilization. I picked up my Lumix S5 for 2,500 Canadian dollars, and it came with a kit lens, whereas the cost of the R6 Mark II is just for the body only without any glass. So just in sharing my opinion, this camera is not good enough for me to upgrade, say if I still had the R6 Mark I. There are some nice features to it, but to me, not enough to convince me to go back to the Canon ecosystem. I would say if you're shooting a lot of 60 frames per second video, or if you need that really fast frame rate in your photography, then sure, it's probably a great upgrade. If you have the money, buy the R6 Mark II over the R6 Mark I, but there's a lot of great features already in the first one that you're not really getting a huge upgrade. It's kind of like a small little upgrade. I highly encourage you guys, do a ton of research before you drop thousands of dollars on a body. As always, this is just one voice, one opinion on the internet, and I hope that it helped you in figuring out your next camera purchase. As always, guys, I appreciate you watching. Feel free to check out this video, and I will see you in the next one.